Hello, in this video we are going to be looking at the physicalist theory of mind known as functionalism. And I'll start with a key point summary. So, in functionalism, the mind is modelled on input, process, output type model. Alright, so you have the input as the external stimuli, the process, which is what the brain does with the information, and then the output, which is our behaviour. Unlike type identity theory, there is no commitment to the nature of the processes involved. And this is a big advantage that functionalism has over type identity theory. The human brain is analogous to a computer. Right? So according to a functionalist, the human brain is in essence an organic computer. And your key scholars here are Jerry Fodor and Hilary Putnam. So the popularity of functionalism relates to its ability to give philosophers the means to place an agent's inner life, so their thoughts and feelings and so on, in a causal relationship with the external world and their own behaviour. According to functionalists, thoughts, pains and other mental events are simply inner states which are produced by external stimuli and which interact with each other and other states of the body to produce outward behavioural responses. So in essence, functionalism is a tripartite model of the following kind. Right? The mind is made up of input, process, output. The inputs come from the environment in which we find ourselves. The processes are what occur in our brains as a result of the information relayed to it by our sensory apparatus, so our eyes, our ears, our nervous system and so on. And the outputs are the behaviour to which these preceding two stages give rise. There are at least two ways of characterising the basic message of functionalism. One way is in terms of what we might call role functionalism, which suggests that thoughts, pains and other mental phenomena are to be identified by the functional or causal roles they play. And this was an idea of Hilary Putnam's. The other way to characterise functionalism might be called realiser functionalism, which is subtly different in that it suggests that mental states should be identified with those things that occupy or realise certain causal roles. For our purposes, however, we will just focus on what the two accounts have in common. So, functionalism is so called because it claims that ascribing mental states to others, when we do that, we are supposing the existence of inner mental states that explain their outward behaviour and actions. In other words, our inner states, such as pain and fear, have a functional role and are directly related to external stimuli and subsequent behaviour. All right? So, for example, in terms of fear, there might be certain things that occur that we know are going to threaten our life. So those are the external stimuli. Our brain registers that information, and we know that these particular things might threaten our life. And so our outward behaviour then manifests fear. So you've got your input, your process in the brain, and your output. Terms like belief and desire are defined by their relation to each other and to other less theoretical entities and events, such as their typical causes and effects. Thus, pain, for the functionalist, is defined in terms of that which typically comes after injury, which is the input, and before responses such as wincing, screaming, writhing, and so on, the output. All right? In this way, mental state terms are given functional definitions. They are defined with reference to their typical causes and effects. This aspect of the functionalist account is similar to behaviourism in that it allows the functionalist to make use of behavioural evidence which is outwardly available to define psychological terms. In other words, the way somebody behaves amount to the criteria for saying that they are angry or fearful or happy and so on. In this way, functionalists don't make the mistake of identity theorists, that is, believing that brain states fully exhaust the criteria for mental description. Remember that type identity theory says that mental and brain states are identical. And this enables functionalists to avoid some of the problems faced by type identity theory. For example, functionalism allows for multiple realizability and neuroplasticity. So they don't really care about the process involved, provided that it yields the right outputs in relation to the external stimuli. Functionalism leaves it completely open as to what kinds of entities, events or processes occupy the role which is described by our mental vocabulary. Thus, functionalists do not attempt to identify psychological states with specific neurophysical types. In other words, functionalism, unlike type identity theory, is not concerned with issues involving the nature of what is actually going on inside the brain. Right? That's the ontological character of the inner states. And it therefore needs to make no attempt to specify the nature of those types of states, be they physical or otherwise. So functionalists are free to debate what is the best theory concerning what kinds of things fill the roles, what processes occur in the brain and what kinds of processes they are, and so on. Now, functionalists believe that it is fruitful to compare the mind to a computer because computers are purely physical and mechanistic, and the most important operations can be characterized in terms of non-mental terms. Right? Thus, if a strong case can be made that the mind really is just an organic computer, then a scientifically respectable materialist account of the mind will have been vindicated. It is the hope that this program will come to fruition that explains why much recent and fashionable thinking about the nature of mind, especially in the domain of cognitive science, has been influenced by the machine analogy or the computer metaphor. In other words, the mind is like a machine or like an organic computer. So let's now look at some objections to functionalism. Functional or computational criteria do not capture the nature of conscious awareness, that is qualia, at all. Functionalism claims that after the process of seeing a colour is fully characterized in functionalist terms and then described in terms of causal stimuli, that is inputs, internal responses, that's processes, and behavioural outputs, there is an important unaccounted for remainder, namely consciousness. Functionalism leaves an inexplicable residue, that of conscious awareness. And this objection is well characterized in Ned Block's China brain example. In Block's famous scenario, the Chinese nation was to simulate the functional states of a frightened human being. So the Chinese people are in contact with one another by radio links, which then control the behavior of a giant robot. The robot responds to the information provided by the Chinese populace via a distant but openly visible satellite. After inputting various bits of information, the Chinese take their cues from the output messages displayed on the satellite and act accordingly. By this process of first informing and then responding to the robot via the radio links, they both alter and are affected by the robot's inner state in a continuous process. The point is that Block believes that a system of this kind of complexity would be able to mimic the functionally characterized behavior of, say, a person in pain. And if this is so, then it could be argued that these two systems do not differ in any functionally recognizable respect. In other words, they're functionally equivalent. From the purely causal or functional point of view, the two systems are simply indistinguishable. So either they must both be assigned conscious experiences or both denied it. Put another way, if functionalism is accurate, then it would seem to ascribe mental states to things that are not conscious. For example, schools, universities, hospitals, and so on, right? All of which act in functionalist ways. Right? So schools have inputs, processes, and outputs. Hospitals have inputs, processes, and outputs. The patients go in to the hospital when they're ill. There are certain processes that go on, and then they emerge, hopefully better. Okay? So a school operates in a functionalist capacity in that it interacts with the external environment in certain ways as a result of inputs and outputs. But in none of these cases can we reasonably suggest that a school or a hospital is conscious, right? Or that it has subjective experiences, that it has qualia. So functionalism does not account for consciousness, right? It assumes the mind functions much as a computer does. Yet we do not say of computers that they think like us, in spite of the fact that they can perform many tasks much more quickly than we can. Similarly, we say of our pet dogs and cats that they are conscious, and yet we do not say this of computers in spite of the fact that they are more able to do more sophisticated things than cats and dogs. So this seems to suggest that the mind, conceived as something that thinks and is conscious, cannot be understood on the basis of the complexity of behaviour or its internal processes. Then there's John Searle's famous Chinese room thought experiment. Alright, and this argues that our life is more than just functions. Take an English speaker with no knowledge of any other language. Put him in a sealed room with a series of Chinese symbols and a rule book on how to match them up. The person then sends certain symbols out of the room when given other symbols by those outside of the room. The people outside the room speak Chinese and think they are communicating with a competent Chinese speaker inside the room. Functionalism implies that the English speaker understands Chinese simply based on these mimicking processes. And Searle's point ultimately is that we as human beings, understand what we are doing, whereas a computer does not. Thus, functionalism leaves out something vital in terms of providing an account of the mind. Right? There's no reason to believe that this functionalist model actually leads to understanding, whereas in terms of the human mind, understanding seems to be a fundamental characteristic. So that's the end of this video. In the next video, we will be looking at behaviorism.